Hi, you're watching the development vlog for Shoken, a multi-platform waitlist management tool soon to be available on Android and iOS. This is Bill from Shoken, and this is week 56 of development. The current status continues to be that the Android and iOS alpha test version of the app is ready and available for testing on Google Play Store and iOS App Store. However, it's important to note that the app continues to receive weekly updates. So in other words, the app state, the build state is not set in stone. Like, it keeps getting updated as I push out more and more bug fixes. There are two major goals last week. The first one was to transition my developer accounts with Google as well as Apple from individual accounts to organizational accounts. And that was done with Google, but not yet done with Apple. Apple takes substantially longer than Google. In their documentation, they said that it should take about a month, if I remember correctly. So that's still ongoing. The application is submitted and it's under review. The second goal for last week was to start creating my product website. In other words, the website I can direct my users to if they're interested in purchasing the product and see what it does and how to sign up and stuff like that. I started on that as well. And there's some considerations given to that because I don't come from a web development background. So in other words, that part of it is completely new to me. And the ways that you have nowadays in terms of building a website on the internet is like, we're spoiled for choices. It's decision paralysis. And I remember looking into it, initially wanting to do it in the Hugo way. In other words, a static site generator, such as Hugo, and then you presumably find a nice theme from Hugo so that you don't have to write your own theme yourself, and publish the website on your GitHub, and then have one of the hosters, for instance, Cloudflare or Netlify, to build and host your site. And the benefit of this is, of course, that unless you're doing a custom domain, the whole thing, so long as you keep the build as well as the traffic in control, is completely free, which is absurd to think nowadays. And the great thing about the static site hosters is, or the static site architecture in terms of building a website, is that they mimic a lot of the dynamic websites. They can have their fun things on the site, while at the same time avoiding the overhead and the cost associated with having a proper dynamic website. So I'm a big fan of static site generators such as Hugo. And in fact, the blog that I'm hosting those vlogs on, I host the videos on YouTube, of course, but I also have a website where I use AI to transcribe my videos and then post a summary for people who don't really want to watch the video. And that website, Indian.dev, ENDIAN.dev, is built using Hugo. And it's really no more than just a couple lines of code that you have to write yourself. And then every week when you publish a new article, it's literally just a markdown file instead of a full-fledged HTML file. So static websites are great, even for lightweight dynamic tasks. I really like them. The problem with Hugo is, of course, that it's the structure, or not necessarily the structure. I mean, Hugo, it can be really customized into doing any type of website that you like, so long as you know how to customize them. But the spirit, if you will, of Hugo is really to host something that's long-living, like it changes from time to time. In other words, a blog website where every day, or not every day, like periodically you would upload new content to it, and then it will sort of aggregate into longer pages and longer stuff like that. And Hugo's really good at doing that. What I found Hugo to be lacking, or at least in terms of community support, is if you want to do a landing page or if you want to do a product page. I know there are themes and support and discussions around that, but the community of Hugo, or the availability of existing assets and existing things that you can just pull and use for yourself on the internet, it's mostly focused around those sort of periodic article publication, as opposed to like a simple marketing website or a landing page. And then, without really a lot of background in website development, what do? You ask AI in terms of the options that you have. And it's interesting that nowadays, every single AI, the big ones, Gemini, Claude, as well as GPT, all recommend for the task I'm looking to do, which is just a simple marketing website with a sign-up form, with a cal.com calendar scheduling widget, and like very simple informational website. They all recommended Astro. And I'm like, okay, let's do Astro. And of course, I have no background in Astro, and I have very limited knowledge in JavaScript. And I, of course, don't want to pick up JavaScript to make a website because, again, the vast majority of my work is done in Kotlin multi-platform for my app, and picking up another language is just, I can do that when I'm retired and have more free time to diddle around with different languages and stuff. Hey, maybe by then, JavaScript would eventually retire in favor of TypeScript because of type safety. In any case, so I don't want to learn language, but I do want to use Astro. Fortunately, AI is there to help as well. I tried different combinations of models as well as tooling to make the website, and I found the best combination is Claude Opus plus anti-gravity. Anti-gravity being the AI IDE that Google has made, and Claude Opus, of course, is a model made by Anthropic. And this is really surprising to me because I found Claude models to be woefully horrible, insufferable when I'm trying to make Android apps with it. I started using, I think I started using as early as Claude and Claude models 3.5. Sonnet, Opus 3.5, and then 3.7, and then 4.0, and then 4.5. And then I've tried each iteration of it, and it had always been very suboptimal. Well, I'm going to say more than suboptimal, just undesirable. One of the biggest issues that I've complained about, and if you don't believe me, you can go back to the video archives that I have, is their unreliability. They don't straight up lie, but they do tell white lies. In other words, they obscure information they don't want you to see. If you wanted to implement 1, 2, 3, for instance, 3 different tasks, and after struggling to implement 1, 2, 3 and failing at, let's say, number 2, it would then report to you that, hey, it's done its job, it's done implementing, it's successful, and it would show you, oh, I've implemented 1 and 3, and conveniently not mention 2. And of course, like if you're single threading and just like staring at the AI screen, you're going to discover that. You're going to question what's going on. And of course, you'll try to fix the problem down the line, whatnot. But one of the biggest advantages of using AI is context switching, right? Asynchronous development. In other words, you send off a task on your computer and then you start working on something else. You start to, be the product manager and architect the solution on another GitHub issue before you send that implementation. With Claude, you can't do that. You can't reliably predict its outcome. So it's just not working. So I switched away from Claude for my main app development to Codex. Codex is not, I'm going to say, capability-wise, Codex is perhaps just a tinge behind Claude, but because of the reliability that it provides you, because of the honesty that it gives you, I found it to be so much more enjoyable to use Codex. So I've been using Codex up until now. However, this analysis is completely sort of upside down with regards to implementing a website. While I'm trying to get Codex to build me a nice-looking website, not giving it any direction in terms of theming, in terms of color choice, in terms of anything. The website that I made, it did make a website. The website did work. It's not very good looking. It's very, I'm not going to say it's as old as GeoCities website, but it's just, it feels like last generation government website, if that makes any sense. Like it's all functional, but it's using standard web components. In other words, it's not trying to do something that's like fancy and breaking other crap on the web page. No, it's not doing that. But it just doesn't feel like, it's not the zeitgeist of the current web design. And another big issue with Codex is that if you use Codex in Codex CLI, it doesn't, unless you set it up yourself, it doesn't really have a very easy way of interacting with the output of the web page. So in other words, when it builds a website, right, it would write down the website files and stuff like that, and then it can use Astro commands to see if the website builds correctly. And then after the website builds, it can serve up a web server and then a query, curl the web server and see if the returned HTML and all the files are actually are returned correctly. What it cannot see is how these files would eventually show up on an end user's browser. In other words, it can't see, it can only interpret. And this is one of the biggest shortcomings when it comes to developing anything that's user-facing. In other words, like there's no feedback loop. The AI can go ahead and implement all kinds of things, and then it would think that it's done the job, and then from the code, you would think so too, but until it's actually rendered by a browser, you don't really have 100% confidence that the user is going to see what you expect them to see. And here's where Google's anti-gravity comes in. Anti-gravity, again, it's an IDE built on Visual Studio Code with their own proprietary whatever overlay on it, and then it connects to Google's AI backend, and you can use Gemini as a model, and then I think the only other company that you can use is Claude. It exposes Claude Sonnet and Opus. Oh, I believe you can also use OSS 120 billion, but I'm not using that because that's an open model. Why use an open model when you can use a closed model? So, well, that's a discussion for another time. And Google's anti-gravity integrates with a browser agent where your AI model can actually directly ask the browser agent to fetch the screenshots as well as screen recordings of the web page. So in other words, after the AI completes its task, it can spin up the web server and then ask the browser agent to literally browse the page that you just created. And this provides a perfect feedback loop where the agent can code and then see what's going on. And if there's something wrong, then the agent can go back and fix it. It's literally like a junior developer. Well, any developer. And as far as I'm concerned, it's probably doing a better job than a lot of senior developers because, the knowledge that it can have and the information that it can have in some models and stuff like that. On top of that, of course, Google Anti-Gravity can also connect to MCP servers. And one of the MCP servers that I set up a long time ago, well, a couple of weeks back, that I've been finding super helpful in terms of making sure that the syntaxes as well as the things that I draw from the libraries and stuff are up to date is Context 7. And Context 7 recently actually just upped their usage limits from 200 per day, I believe, to about 500 per day. It's way more than I need for any type of development task. So with Context 7 set up in Google Anti-Gravity and the browser-based agent that the AI model can use, you have a fairly, I think I'm confident enough to say, a fairly bulletproof setup. You have the model to think for you. You have the Context 7 for the model to fetch the latest documentation. And then you have the browser agent to then give the feedback to the agent. And this is ridiculous in terms of the throughput that you can get from this. And just for reference, I started this website, the product website, last week, I think. And I think by this week, I'm almost done in terms of the feature completeness and the colors and the layouts and all the things that I want to have on a website. If I can write an Android app in 2 weeks, I'd be really happy, but we're not there yet. Of course, the web development is, the tooling as well as the entire infrastructure is far more advanced and powerful than mobile development. So I'm finding the combination of Opus 4.5 and Google Anti-Gravity seem to be very potent combination, at least for my purposes, for my usage case. Unfortunately, what recently just happened, I discovered as early as, I believe, yesterday, Google nerfed like significantly the quota on Opus for Google Anti-Gravity. Now I believe I run out of my five-hour quota in 5 prompts. Not long chain prompts, just 5 short prompts. And there are some murmurings on the internet about whether or not this was intentional. Maybe Google wants to eventually phase out Claude models and rely heavily on Gemini models. And honestly, Gemini is also not as good as Claude when it comes to web-based development. I asked Gemini to create the website for me. It's still not as good. It's better than Codex, mind you, but nowhere near as good as Opus. So if Google does heavily nerf the usage limit for Opus or remove it entirely, I'm going to have to go back to investigating Claude code, and perhaps I'd have to set up my MCP server manually for the Claude code to be able to query, to be able to control the browser agent to then do the view and debug loop. In any case, so the web page from last week, it's mostly done. The 2 components that I still need to do are the screenshots from my app as well as the screen recording for the app. And this is another part that I learned a lot about, which is you want your screenshots and screen recordings to be not only informative, but also punchy, impactful. You want this content to be immediately attention-grabbing to your users so that when they see it, it conveys not only function, but also quality and polish. And for that, unfortunately, you have to learn video editing. And that's a new area that you have to investigate. I don't know video editing. I mean, I know how to take this video from this card and do some minimal processing to make sure that my audio is not noisy and stuff like that, and uploading it to YouTube. But outside of that, I don't know video editing. And of course, I don't want to pay somebody to do that for me. If I start paying people to do things for me, before long, I'm going to have to go back to the workforce sooner or later, right? So I will have to learn that myself. And that's the goal for next week. Well, that's one of the goals for next week, which is to figure out some basic tooling around video editing and try to come up with some of the punchy and grabby things in terms of screenshots and screen recording from my app. The other one, another goal, this is a continuous goal that I've been working through every day, is fixing bugs. And last week, I think I closed about 10 to 15 tickets. And the crazy part about those tickets is that for every ticket that you close, 2 new tickets come up. And so next week, we deal with, you continue to deal with tickets, those bugs that you discover as you and other testers start to test it. I have to give a big shout out to my wife, who opened my first user-based, well, actually, she didn't open the tickets. I think somebody else did. Somebody else tested this before she did. But there are a lot of bugs that we discovered. And it's interesting how a different perspective testing, like a different tester, can bring in a lot of things that you just sort of overlooked. And this sort of highlights the importance of testing. I remember as an engineer and not a QA person, I loathed testing, and I really didn't think it was terribly necessary because I was in my, the hubris of mankind, if you will. Now I think I recognize the importance, and I think I'm definitely going to get more and more people to do it. And after the product website is complete, I'm going to start reaching out to people and start actually getting a substantial amount of testing done on the app. One of the things that I learned is that regressions can happen from build to build, and if you want your first publishable build to be a punchy and bug-free one, you'd have to freeze your build at some point and then test heavily against that. And I haven't gotten to the point where I have the confidence to freeze any particular build, so I need to squash more bugs before I freeze the build and then start heavily testing against that build. That's another goal for next week. And the third goal is I have no choice. I have to put in RevenueCat. because when I start getting people to sign up and start using the services, costs will start to incur pretty significant costs. As a result, my billing system needs to be in place before I let loose the activities on my servers that can start crushing me with costs. So RevenueCat needs to go back in again. And I remember I implemented RevenueCat earlier last year. And I remember the implementation to be non-trivial. And last week, I think I went through the provider side of the configuration, in other words, the Play Store, App Store, as well as RevenueCat side of the configuration, as well as Supabase, my actual backend for them to be able to talk to each other with regards to purchases. I've also set up purchases, and I think part of the goal for next week is to wire up RevenueCat into my app and then come up with a paywall for that to work and set up mock purchases so that I can start testing mock purchases, the purchase flow within the app for people to unlock the features of the app and start using it. Anyways, there's a lot of, the closer you get to test launch, the more problems or tasks seem to emerge. And I'm finding that to be a pattern. And if I actually have some time and more saliva, I probably will make another video sort of diving into the deeper end of that particular phenomenon. It's quite interesting. I'm not going to say it's overwhelming because, nothing is really overwhelming in life. You have a problem, you list the problem out, you subdivide it into 10 different points, and then you work on them one by one, right? But it is a lot. So it's non-trivial, but these are interesting problems to tackle, and every single one of them represents a valuable learning opportunity that you otherwise wouldn't have if you just worked for a gigantic corporation, never having to touch any of those different parts of the business. In any case, this is probably one of the longest weekly updates. I apologize for the length of my soliloquy, and this is it for this week. I hope to see you next week.